pause will be extended?
Jonathan, it's an interesting dilemma, really, for both sides. Once the hostages are all released, let's say if Israel would get that, there'd be no reason for Israel to stop their military campaign again. So there's probably a calculus in terms of how many hostages can be released vis-a-vis how long the truce can go on. I do think it will likely be extended. I wonder if at this point, Israel's military objectives may be limited, meaning they don't have or have not discovered the large command centers that they claimed that they were going after. They may not be really hitting Hamas's leadership at this point. So why not take a pause, get as many hostages as possible, and then start to reset what your military objectives might be? That comes, as you just noted, with all the pressure internationally that's currently there for reduction in civilian casualties. And to do that would be to come up with a more surgical plan rather than the kind of just very broad taking of all of northern Gaza. It could be Israel can use this time to really reset what their military objectives are, other than just completely destroying Gaza. So I am hopeful that there will be more hostage exchanges and there'll be a longer truce over the next few days.
So a related question to that, Clint, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in a video statement yesterday, said he told the United States President, President Biden, that once this pause is completed, whenever that might be, the war will continue, quote, full power. So that would seem to be contrary to these targeted strikes that you're suggesting. What do you think he means?
Yeah, I think the idea or the pressure of continued military action from the Israelis is probably critical to their strategy. Without continuing to press or threatening to continue to press in the same way as before, you're just not going to see that kind of negotiation go back and forth. At the same point, we've seen them take lots of northern Gaza. We've seen refugees moving to southern Gaza. We've then seen the Israelis go in, take into that tunnel, a little bit into one tunnel, very near that Al-Shifa hospital, but then talking about moving down to Khan Yunis, moving south again, pursuing different targets. That's very, very difficult. That would mean lots of civilian casualties. So I think they really need to weigh what their military objectives are. If hostages are the focal point, it seems like it is in the current, a pause is probably makes more sense. Separately, the mounting pressure internationally that's going to be coming on Netanyahu in terms of their military strategy will be intense. So they'll have to pick some sort of a middle ground, I think. Just saying total annihilation of Gaza is not going to be a palatable choice for most of the international supporters of Israel.
And Clint, if we just mentioned what I feel like is an underreported storyline here, is that Hamas doesn't actually have all the hostages themselves, that some have been taken by these other sort of splinter groups within Gaza. And I think, of course, there are probably some hostages whose whereabouts are perhaps unknowns, even to the Hamas leaders. So tell us a little bit more about the challenges that poses, and that we know that there are some Americans still unaccounted for, perhaps they're with these groups. How difficult will it be to get them back?
It's going to be very difficult, Jonathan. I think the other thing is this is more akin to what we would see in tribal Pakistan. If you might remember 10 to 20 years ago, if there was somebody who was captured or lost, they would be pushed between one group and another. We used to call it Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, but really it was dozens of different groups all pursuing their own interests. I think here in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad was one of the actors. They took some of the hostages. Hamas has some of them. Remember, some of Hamas's leaders have been killed in recent weeks, which means you probably have a shakeup in terms of the chain of command and who's in charge and who is respected. It's going to be a very complicated endeavor. It would mean negotiating with multiple separate groups, all with different interests. I'm not sure how that would play out over time. I'm sure some would be more resistant, some would be more amenable, but we are talking as if it's just Hamas. It's probably several different groups of hostages.
All right, well, really appreciate the insight and analysis this morning from national security analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, Clint Watts. Thank you so much for starting us off this morning. We will speak to you again soon. Meanwhile, President Biden has not ruled out the possibility of sending aid to Israel with conditions. That's according to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who appeared on Meet the Press yesterday.
Just to be very clear, should we take his words that it would be a worthwhile thought to mean that the president is open to signing legislation that would provide aid to Israel that comes with conditions?
I thought the president really couldn't have been clearer when he answered the question. He acknowledged the idea, and then he said, but the way that I have conducted our diplomacy in this is what is actually producing results. That's what he's done so far, and that's what he's going to do.
Is he open to it?
Again, he is going to continue to focus on what is going to generate results. And as he said in the press conference quite clearly, and as you can see from the fact that for the last 2 days we've seen hostages released, the approach that he is taking, direct presidential diplomacy behind closed doors with the Israelis and with our Arab partners, that's what's generating the kinds of results that we're seeing right now. That's the course that he's on.
At the same time, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has written a letter to his Democratic colleagues stating that he intends to bring the president's $105 billion emergency national funding package to the floor for a vote next week. Now, this supplemental package would provide aid to Israel, Ukraine, make improvements to the U.S. immigration system, and devote some resources to the Indo-Pacific. The Republican-led House has already passed an aid bill for Israel, but it includes massive cuts to the IRS and excludes humanitarian assistance. That's simply a non-starter for the White House and Senate Democrats. Schumer urged Democrats to work across the aisle to help push for a bipartisan path forward in the coming weeks. He also revealed he will bring a resolution to the floor that will allow the Senate to bypass Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville's blockade of military promotions. But the clock is really ticking on that funding, because if we reach into the new year, then Congress will be gripped again with another spending fight to keep the government open. It'll be tough to pass this funding package. Still ahead here on Way Too Early, we'll bring you some new reporting on a questionable pardon from Donald Trump on the final day of his presidency and what it could mean if he were to win a second term. Plus, a recap of the busy holiday travel week following last year's transportation troubles. Those stories, check on sports and weather when we come right back. Welcome back to Way Too Early on this Monday morning. Former President Donald Trump is the far-away frontrunner in the Republican presidential primary, and with the possibility of Trump returning to the White House growing, there are now new details about how he reportedly used his power as commander-in-chief. The New York Times did some reporting this weekend, and at 12:51 a.m. on his final day in office, Trump granted clemency to a convicted marijuana trafficker named Jonathan Braun. I'll read from the story here. At the time, Trump's own Justice Department and federal regulators, as well as New York State authorities, were still after Mr. Braun for his role in an entirely separate matter. His work as a predatory lender, making what judges later found were fraudulent and usurious loans to cash-strapped small businesses. According to the Times, Braun was put on Trump's radar by Charles Kushner, the father of Trump's son-in-law and White House advisor, Jared Kushner, and Trump's commutation hurt a broader criminal investigation by his own DOJ into predatory lending. In an interview with the Times, Braun said he did not know how his commutation was decided and described a picture of him and his wife with Trump as a chance encounter at one of his golf clubs. We'll have more on this story later on Morning Joe. Meanwhile, one of the former Minneapolis police officers convicted of killing George Floyd is expected to survive a brutal assault at the federal prison where he is serving time. On Friday, the officers, Derek Chauvin, was stabbed at the Federal Correctional Institution in Tucson, Arizona. The Federal Bureau of Prisons confirmed that an incarcerated individual was assaulted about 12:30 p.m. local time. The agency says the inmate was treated for life-threatening injuries and taken to the hospital for treatment and evaluation. On Saturday, the Minnesota Attorney General's office confirmed in a statement that Chauvin is expected to survive. In 2021, he was convicted of murdering Floyd, a Minnesota resident accused of trying to use counterfeit money at a convenience store. Chauvin was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Last year, he was convicted on federal charges and given a 21-year concurrent sentence for violating Floyd's civil rights. Floyd's death, of course, sparked nationwide protests. It's Monday now, and millions of Americans made their way back home over the weekend after the Thanksgiving holiday. And more people were set to pass through America's airports yesterday than ever before. NBC News correspondent Marissa Para has more.
The biggest test for the nation's airports they've ever faced. The mad rush home from the holiday, leading to what's predicted to be the biggest air travel day in American history.
Hopefully we can get through this line and get to
Chicago. Nationwide, delays topped 4,000, but cancellations less than 50.
There is going to be some snow on the roadways.
14 million were under winter weather alert from Iowa to Maine. On the roads, snow, ice, causing accidents across Kansas. But in the air,
I think it's a little bit of a victory lap for the industry because everything this holiday travel season has gone smoothly, even with a couple storms thrown in the mix.
TSA has seen 7 of its 10 busiest travel days on record this year, without the major nationwide meltdowns we saw last year.
They staffed up appropriately, and I think that's the biggest thing in getting such a mass amount of people through the airport.
Good news there indeed. NBC's Marissa Para with the reporting. Still ahead here on Way Too Early, we'll turn to sports and a look at yesterday's action around the NFL, including an overtime thriller in Philadelphia and the worst game ever played. We'll bring you all that and a look at the forecast to start off the work week.
And the Eagles have won it in overtime.
Those were some of the biggest plays from across the NFL yesterday, including the career-high 5th touchdown of the game for Eagles quarterback Jalen Hurts. Let's go to Inglewood, California now, and a breakout. Ravens rookie Zay Flowers on the road against the Chargers.
Some heavy snow in spots. We're even seeing the snow into portions of New England right now. Heavy rain in Maine, but that will move off for the most part. May linger a bit into the afternoon. The big weather story will be this snow. Generally, we're looking at 3 to 6 inches in most spots, but downwind of Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, we're looking at some really blockbuster snow. Could see up to 4 feet in some spots in portions of upstate New York, the Tug Hill Plateau region. And then the other big story, we're looking at temperatures really frigid across the country. We're looking at 27 degrees today in Chicago. That's 16 degrees below what is typical for this time. Temperatures in the 40s in Nashville, just 34 in Pittsburgh. And then as we go throughout tomorrow, we're going to keep that chill in place. We're looking at temperatures below freezing in many spots.
To Way Too Early. It is 5:30 a.m. on the East Coast, 2:30 out west on this Monday morning. I'm Jonathan Lemire. Thanks for being with us. From the it girl to the Mary Magdalene of the United States Congress. That's how embattled Republican Congressman George Santos described his own trajectory on Capitol Hill during a defiant speech Friday night, a speech that was sprinkled with taunts and obscenities aimed at his fellow lawmakers. Santos went on to say he expects to be expelled when the House votes on the matter, which is likely to happen later this week. But Santos, at least, is suggesting he doesn't seem to care.
I don't care. You want to expel me? I'll wear it like a badge of honor. I'll be the 6th expelled member of Congress in the history of Congress. And guess what? I'll be the only one expelled without a conviction.
Joining us now, co-founder of Punchbowl News, Jake Sherman. He's also an MSNBC political contributor. Jake, good to see you. So let's just start there with Santos. Did anything he say strike you as actually noteworthy? And secondly, what are the mechanics about how he will be expelled this week?
Well, I don't know what he means by the it girl or whatever. I mean, he was a backbench member of Congress who's been here for a year. There was nothing notable about George Santos besides his the allegations that are stunning. And by the way, John, it reported in rich detail in an ethics committee report that was out this week. So, I mean, we're not talking about the second coming of Lyndon Baines Johnson here. We're talking about a member of Congress who is, really enmeshed in a serious legal battle right now with the ethics committee, number one, and the Department of Justice, which has indicted him. So that's number one. Number two, there's been an expulsion resolution filed against Santos. Santos will, some member of Congress will have to raise that as privileged, which begins the clock ticking on a vote. So that could happen Wednesday or Thursday, the vote. Santos could resign beforehand. He seems to be indicating in that Twitter space or X space that he's not going to do so. So that means he's going to be expelled, which, by the way, narrows the majority once again. And then just to add, John, if Bill Johnson of Ohio, who recently accepted the job to be president of Youngstown State University, if he goes, and then if December 8th is the filing deadline for California, let's say just for argument's sake that Kevin McCarthy goes, you're at a 218 seat majority. That's the smallest majority you could have in the House of Representatives.
And Republicans for a year now have already really struggled with such a slim majority, one that might shrink further, as you say. So let's move on from Santos and talk about the aid package. We mentioned earlier in the show that Senator Schumer's trying to bring that before the Senate next week. Give us the sense as to how that will play out, and what are the odds that they're going to be able to get something done, Senate and House, on this aid package? Is it going to include anything on Ukraine, considering these loud voices in the GOP who oppose it?
I would say no. Well, first of all, Mike Turner said, I believe on Meet the Press yesterday, that nothing will happen until next year. That's a huge blow to the administration. But Ukraine and Israel are going to have to move separately in the House of Representatives. There's no question about that. Mike Johnson has became the first speaker in history, or not in history, but in recent history, to condition Israel aid to domestic spending cuts, which has held up the Israel aid process. So a lot happening here, but I don't see any quick solution at all in any way, shape, or form.
All right. Well, we'll be certainly tracking that in the days ahead. Co-founder of Punchbowl News, Jake Sherman, thank you. We will speak to you again soon. Still ahead here, we're going to be joined by our friends at CNBC for a look at this morning's business headlines, as well as some insight on the markets, which are down before the bell. You can see the red there. That's all straight ahead. Back, it's time now for business. And for that, let's bring in CNBC's Juliana Tatelbaum, who joins us live from London. Good to see you, Juliana. So Wall Street coming off its fourth straight winning week for all three major averages. How is this week starting off?
Oh, John, great to see you this morning. Hopefully you had a great holiday weekend. As for U.S. futures this morning, we're looking at a pretty muted start to trade. Downbeat, but muted, I would say. We do have a number of economic indicators to look out for this week. You got new home sales coming up, and a little bit later in the week, we're going to get a fresh read of inflation in the U.S., the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation. In fact, we're also going to hear from a number of Fed officials. And then later in the week, we're also going to be keeping an eye on energy. You've got the OPEC Plus meeting taking place, so oil prices are going to be closely watched this week by the investment community.
So we, of course, as you mentioned, it was Thanksgiving weekend, which also means Black Friday. And early Black Friday sales data is pointed to a pretty healthy start to the holiday season, shopping season, at least online. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, exactly. I think that's key. Online sales have been quite strong. Still, the jury is out on how foot traffic has fared this Black Friday. We've got, according to Adobe Analytics, Black Friday sales came in at $9.8 billion in the U.S. online. That's up 7.5% from where we were a year ago. Consumers clearly looking to take advantage of these big deals. Interestingly, according to this survey, $79 million of the sales came from consumers who used the Buy Now, Pay Later flexible payment scheme, up nearly 50% from last year. So perhaps tells you a little bit of something about the state of the consumer health and the consumer wallet at this stage. What are people buying? The best-selling categories: electronics, so smartphones, televisions, toys, and gaming also pretty hot when it comes to these deals and sales. On the flip side, home repair tools underperformed.
Well, I didn't buy any, that's for sure. Lastly, Juliana, the average long-term U.S. mortgage rate fell for the fourth time in as many weeks. Good news. What does it mean for prospective home buyers?
Well, John, I'm with you. I didn't contribute to those home repair tool sales. But on to the housing market. This is pretty interesting data. The average long-term U.S. mortgage rate fell for the fourth time in 4 weeks, as you said, which brings the 30-year rate down to 7.29% on average from 7.44% last week. So it is down, but still very elevated from where we were just a couple of years ago. About 2 years ago, the average 30-year home loan rate was around 3%, so more than double where we were. Also, despite the recent pullback, it looks as though potential homebuyers are still holding out for rates to come down further and for more inventory to come online. So a trend to watch, I would say.
No question, and one that seems to be shaping our nation's politics as well. So much unhappiness about the inability to afford a home here in the United States, particularly among young people. CNBC's Juliana Tatelbaum live from London. Terrific stuff as always. Thank you. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Still ahead here on Way Too Early, we'll break down the role that President Biden played in securing the release of 4-year-old Abigail Eden, the first American hostage to be freed from Gaza since the pause in fighting with Hamas. Plus, an exodus from Washington. Why dozens of congressional members will not be seeking re-election next year. That's coming up next on Way Too Early.
One of our fellow Americans, a little girl named Abigail, who turned 4 years old. She spent her birthday, and at least 50 days before that, held hostage by Hamas. Today, she's free, and Jill and I, together with so many Americans, are praying for the fact that she is going to be all right. You know, she's free and she's in Israel now. More is needed, but this deal is delivering life-saving results. Critically needed aid is going in and hostages are coming out. And this deal is structured so that it can be extended, to keep building on these results. That's my goal, that's our goal, to keep this pause going beyond tomorrow so that we can continue to see more hostages come out and surge more humanitarian relief into those who in need in Gaza.
As we return to our top story now, that was President Biden yesterday in Nantucket speaking about Abigail Eden, the first American hostage released as part of this pause agreement between Israel and Hamas. Abigail turned 4 years old on Friday while being held captive by terrorists. Joining us now, Pentagon reporter for Politico, Lara Seligman. Lara, good to see you again. Certainly good news that Abigail is now out of Hamas's hands. Tell us a little bit more about what U.S. officials are saying, the role that the United States and in particular President Biden played in getting the little girl free.
Good morning, Jonathan. Thanks so much for having me. President Biden has played a key role in this negotiations from the beginning. He's been steadfastly supporting Israel, and he's made multiple phone calls to his Israeli counterpart. He's even visited Israel in the early weeks of the crisis. So just the fact that this deal happened is a win for the Biden administration. We're hoping to see a fourth round of hostages released today. The question now will be whether both sides can agree to extend the ceasefire, which is something President Biden has been personally pushing for, to allow much needed aid to flow into Gaza and, of course, the release of additional hostages, including Americans that are still held in Gaza. It's not clear whether Hamas in particular is going to agree to an extension of the ceasefire. It turned out on Saturday, even the deal almost fell apart because both sides pointed fingers at each other, saying the other one violated the terms of the agreement. So a fragile truce right now.
Yeah, no question about that. Lara, you mentioned these other Americans. What more do we know as to who might even have them there in Gaza? And tell us about the challenges that we now face to try to bring them home.
So one of the problems here is that it's not just Hamas that's holding these hostages in Gaza. It's also other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups like that. So we don't even know necessarily where all of the hostages are. So that does make it very difficult. Another question that we will be watching here is whether the Biden administration can use the pause to urge Israel to, when it does resume combat operations, actually decrease the significance of the operation and maybe lessen it, maybe make it more targeted, and allow some needed aid in. But of course, it doesn't seem like Israel has much incentive to do that, to pause its operations further or to end them completely, because it has stated from the beginning that it wants to completely destroy Hamas in Gaza. It hasn't done that yet. It's reached Gaza City. There's still Hamas. It has a foothold in the south. So it doesn't seem like this war is going to end anytime soon.
All right, Pentagon reporter for Politico, Lara Seligman, thank you as always. I'm certain we'll be speaking to you again very, very soon. Meanwhile, back here in the United States, a suspect has now been arrested in connection to Saturday night's shooting of 3 college students of Palestinian descent. That took place in Vermont. A 48-year-old white male was detained yesterday after law enforcement found probable cause during a search warrant on his apartment to carry out the arrest. The alleged shooter will be arraigned in court later today. This comes as 2 of his victims are in stable condition, while one sustained more serious injuries. The group of friends were in Burlington, Vermont for Thanksgiving break, having known each other since attending the same Quaker school in the West Bank. The friends were walking to a relative's home at the time of the attack, speaking Arabic and wearing traditional Palestinian scarves. Police say the suspected shooter did not say a word before he fired at least 4 times. He hit all 3 men. The families are asking law enforcement to investigate the shooting as a hate crime. We will bring you more on this story, suspect now in custody, as it develops throughout the morning. Up next here on Way Too Early, dozens of lawmakers on Capitol Hill are heading for the door. We'll dig into what's behind their decision not to seek re-election and the potential impact on the balance of power there on Capitol Hill. And then, coming up on Morning Joe,